Good day. Before I begin this video, I would like to apologise for a mistake I made in my previous video. In my previous video, I spoke about an article by Robert Clark, which had appeared in the Daily Telegraph. The article in question, the one that I actually covered, is an article by Michael Clark, which appeared in the Sunday Times. Now, I wish to prefer my apology to both gentlemen, Mr. Michael Clark and Mr. Robert Clark, for confusing or perhaps conflating their two articles. I say conflating their articles because, as I'm going to discuss shortly, in my opinion, these two articles, each of them or both of them, say essentially the same thing, which is that Ukraine is running out of time, or to be more precise, that Ukraine's offensive is running out of time. That was what Michael Clark's article in the Sunday Times says. It is basically and essentially what Robert Clark's article in the Daily Telegraph says, and as we will see, it's what's also been said in articles by CNN and also by Richard Kemp in the Daily Telegraph also. There is now a gathering consensus in the West, in the Western media. It's trickling through to the media, I am sure, from concerns that are being expressed amongst Western governments between each other, that the clock is ticking, that time is running out, that Ukraine's offensive has now been underway for 2 months, almost 2 months, and there is very little to show for all the effort and for all the fighting and for all the suffering that is taking place. But before I discuss those articles, and I'm not going to spend an inordinate amount of time doing so, because as we shall see, they all say the same thing. I'm going to, again, discuss the situation on the battlefronts. And again, there isn't actually a huge amount to say. There have been further Ukrainian attacks in the Rabotino sector of the Russian front lines. The front lines opposite the Ukrainian-held town of Orechov in Zaporozhye region. Ukraine continues to send columns of troops pushing towards Rabotino. The Russians wait, intercept these troops, they shell them, they attack them with anti-tank missiles and such things. These troops, sometimes with supporting armor, sometimes on foot, these Ukrainian troops then have to navigate the Russian minefields, which get reseeded by the Russians every night, as far as I can see. There is complaints, I believe this was actually from Michael Clark, that the Russian minefields are of treble the density typical of most armies. I wonder which armies. Would that be perhaps Western armies, which have little experience in the last 30 or so years of defensive war? The Russians, drawing on their experiences in the Second World War, still very much a living memory in Russia, might have a different view about the density that a minefield needs to be. Just saying. But anyway, the Ukrainians try to navigate these minefields. They get attacked, as I said, by Russian artillery, by Russian anti-tank weapons, by Russian infantry sometimes with machine guns and small arms, mortars. Sometimes Russian tanks join the fray in some form. The Ukrainians take appalling losses. Many of their vehicles are destroyed, and the steppe land south of Orechov is now becoming a graveyard of Ukrainian armour, including, of course, armour supplied to Ukraine from Germany and the United States, Bradleys and Leopard 2 tanks and such things. Anyway, and the pattern has repeated itself day after day, week after week. There are more Russian commentaries appearing to the effect that Ukrainian troops are becoming increasingly reluctant in this sector to continue their advances. There was a very interesting article, or at least an article that appeared to this effect in the Russian news agency TASS about the fact that Ukrainian troops are in fact becoming increasingly unwilling to engage in offensive operations. Of course, it is from TASS. Perhaps one shouldn't take it completely literally. Maybe it's just a Russian view. But for my part, if it were indeed the case that the Ukrainians are becoming increasingly unwilling to advance in this area, it wouldn't surprise me. The article, by the way, quotes the acting governor of Zaporozhye region, Yevgeny Belitsky, and he says this: the Ukrainian servicemen refuse to go on the offensive in the Zaporozhye area. Many are surrendering to save their lives. You may remember that my interpretation of that strange episode of the Ukrainian infantry fighting vehicle zooming past, apparently it moved to the southeast of Rabotino, not to the southwest, as I incorrectly said, but maps, as I've discussed many times, are not my strong suit. But the solitary infantry fighting vehicle that went trundling along, even after all the other Ukrainian infantry fighting vehicles and armour had retreated, it bypassed Rabotino until it hit and turned over in a ditch on the Surovikin line, the only Ukrainian vehicle up to this point to have reached the Surovikin line. Anyway, my own view of that is that this was probably an attempted desertion. I don't know whether it was successful. Maybe the crew was injured, maybe they were killed, maybe they did surrender. But whatever it was, that is my own personal view of what that was all about. And then Belitsky goes on to say the losses on the enemy side are colossal. Our units see the uncoordinated actions of the enemy, who began to form combined assault groups from different units and brigades to continue to throwing their soldiers to the slaughter. Well, that's what Belitsky says, and as I said, he is a Russian official. You don't have to believe everything that he says, and perhaps he's exaggerating to some extent, but the claim that the Ukrainians are having to cobble together units from disparate brigades is probably true. It's something that the Russian Defense Ministry has been talking about for some time, and of course it would not surprise me. By the way, on the question of losses, let me reiterate again something that was said a short time ago by a Russian war correspondent, that at the scale of the losses Ukraine is currently suffering, Ukraine is losing the equivalent of a battalion of troops a day. And that's, of course, in terms of dead and wounded. But that's the level of losses that Ukraine is absorbing. And I suspect that those numbers, by the way, that calculation is roughly true. So more attacks in the Rabotino area, Orekhov-Rabotino area, all of them repulsed. Apparently some kind of attack in the Pyatikhatki area, again repulsed. More Ukrainian attempts to send boats across the Dnieper River to try to establish some kind of a bridgehead on the eastern banks of the Kherson of the Dnieper River and Kherson region, the Russian-held eastern bank, close to the Antonovsky Bridge. Again, most of the boats intercepted, apparently, and destroyed by the Russians. Ukrainian attempts to establish a bridgehead here, proving consistently unsuccessful. And if we go further east, there's now been confirmation of those reports that the Russians did indeed mount a counterattack in Staromayorsk. I said yesterday that Alexander Khodorkovsky, the head of the Vostok regiment of the Donbass militia, had published a report that appeared to contradict evidence, the fact of a Russian counterattack. It looks as if a counterattack did indeed take place, and it seems as if the Ukrainians have indeed been pushed back, either entirely out of Staromayorsk. Denis Pushilin, the acting head of the Donetsk regional government, has made that claim this morning, but as a commentator on Slavyangrad has absolutely correctly said, Pushilin does sometimes anticipate success before it happens, but it has either the Russians have retaken what I suppose would be better described as the ruins of Staromayorsk, or they've pushed the Ukrainians back in parts of it, or perhaps their objective was simply to drive the Ukrainians out and to leave this village in the grey zone, in other words, under nobody's actual control. Ultimately, I suspect, by the way, that the last is the true Russian objective. Anyway, it does seem as if that counterattack was underway, and at least reports suggest that it was either completely or largely successful. And I suspect that Khodorkovsky's report that was circulating yesterday was written before that counterattack took place, before it was understood, as I said, that the fight for Staromayorsk is still contested. Now, let me reiterate a point which actually Khodorkovsky has previously made, which is that Staromayorsk itself is not a particularly important place in and of itself. It's on the Vremevka ledge. The Vremevka ledge is a difficult place for the Russians to defend. There's only one small winding road there, which both the Ukrainians and the Russians have to use. The road, it's a small road, as even Maxim Tucker of the Times, London Times, who's been in that area, has confirmed. It's not perhaps the ideal road through which to mount a big armoured push towards Mariupol, which seems to be the underlying objective. And as a Ukrainian soldier called Sergei told Maxim Tucker, well, there's at least another 12 villages between Staromayorsk and Mariupol, and it took the Ukrainians a week to capture Staromayorsk, according to Maxim Tucker's report. How much longer would it take them to take all those other 12 villages? And of course, that soldier didn't, in fact, point out that the great fortifications, the Surovikin line, actually lie beyond Staromayorsk, and that the Ukrainians haven't yet reached it. So it's not perhaps in itself a hugely important place, in the great scheme of things. But of course, if the Russians have recaptured it or have driven the Ukrainians out of it, then given the enormous effort Ukraine has expended in capturing this one village, it will have a psychological impact on on soldiers like Oleg and Sergei, who were discussed, talked about in that, and who gave reports to the London Times, to Mr. Tucker. They will wonder what all their sacrifice, all that fighting they did to capture Staromayorsk, what it was ultimately for. And of course, it could also become important if the Russians are indeed able to convert it into a kind of Piatikhatki, a kind of dead zone, which neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians can enter, because it is fully covered by each side's artillery, something which, by the way, if it were to happen, and which would repeat, as I said, the pattern in Piatikhatki, would in effect mean the end of the Ukrainian advance in this particular area, and which would put Mariupol conclusively beyond Ukraine's reach. Now, there's also continues to be heavy fighting in and around Kleshchevka. I say in and around Kleshchevka. I'm not absolutely sure that fighting is actually taking place in Kleshchevka. The last report I saw about Kleshchevka itself, this is that village south west of Artyomsk, the former Bakhmut, which Ukraine has been trying to capture. Again, somewhat on Slavyangrad, that indispensable channel which anybody who wants to understand what's actually going on in the war needs to read and follow. Slavyangrad, it's a telegram channel, pro-Russian, but hugely insightful and very accurate in its reporting, and covers also reporting from the Ukrainian side as well. But anyway, a commentator on Slavyangrad, I suspect it was in fact Gleb Bazov, who is its founder, has actually questioned whether Kleshchevka also is of any great strategic significance. The problem has been in the Bakhmut area that Bakhmut was captured by the Russians as recently as the 20th of May, just 2 weeks before Ukraine began its offensive. There wasn't enough time for the Russians to create major fortifications in the Bakhmut area after its capture, or to consolidate their position there. There's some criticism from the Russian side that Prigozhin and pulled out the Wagner troops too quickly, that he left the job unfinished, that he needed to push further west to take up lines along a river or stream that is passing along there, and that his forces didn't even dig trenches as they advanced. Well, as I said, I'm not going to revisit all of that. But anyway, the key point is that Kleshchevka itself, whether it is actually, whether the Ukrainians have even managed to gain entry into Kleshchevka or not, and as I said, the latest reports I saw is that they've been pushed out. Well, again, Kleshchevka is not the most important place in itself on the battlefields. And as I said, Gleb Bazov, if it was him, on Slavyangrad says it's not of enormous strategic relevance anyway. Even in this sector, even whilst Ukraine is bogged down trying to capture Kleshchevka, the Russians have been making up for lost time by building much stronger fortified lines to the east of Kleshchevka, on a ridge just east of it and beyond that. And in fact, progress for the Ukrainians would actually begin to become even harder even if they were to succeed in capturing Kleshchevka itself. Anyway, many of you, I am sure, will have noticed one important fact about this fighting, and that is that for several days now, in fact, I think more than days, I think more than a week, perhaps 2 weeks now, when I've been discussing the fighting in Ukraine, Ukraine's counteroffensive, I'm now repeatedly talking about the same places: Piatichatki, Rabotino, Staromayorsk, Klesheyevka. The fighting has become a battle and offensive, not to capture towns or to break through defenses, but to capture small villages. And I think the most insightful comment of all, which I've read over the last couple of days, was said on a thread to a report of Slavyangrad by some unknown commentator to me, in which this person simply made the point that so long as this offensive becomes a battle for the capture of these small villages, then Ukraine is losing. It is, after all, supposed to be engaged in some big, major offensive to break through the Russian lines. If it's struggling simply to capture these relatively small villages, well, it's bogged down in an attrition war on Russian terms, and a attrition war is fatal, is ultimately fatal to itself. Now, I'm going to just add one particular further point, which comes back to a stream of comments I used to get from all kinds of people. Some of them, no doubt, very well-intentioned and sincere people. Some of them, I suspect, perhaps not so. During the fighting in Bakhmut in the winter and spring and late autumn of last year. Anyway, over the course of the weeks and months leading up to the capture of Bakhmut, the Russian capture of Bakhmut. And all sorts of people say that it was taking the Russians an inordinate amount of time to capture Bakhmut. And this one town in Ukraine, only 70,000 people, and that the Russians were taking weeks and months to capture Bakhmut. And I pointed out that at the time, that yes, I had expected Bakhmut to fall more quickly, which was undoubtedly the case, but I felt that the reason that Ukraine had been able to hold on to Bakhmut for so long was because it spent disproportionate resources defending Bakhmut and suffered as a result disproportionate losses in doing so. It lost far more men defending Bakhmut than it was logical or proportionate for it to do. And I still hold strongly to that view. In fact, nothing that has happened since has caused me to change it. On the contrary, I feel that the attrition war that the Russians fought against the Ukrainians in Bakhmut has actually worked out to their advantage. Many of Ukraine's best troops were indeed killed or wounded beyond recovery in Bakhmut, and I'm sure that this is having an effect on the progress of the offensive now. But my point is this. A lot of people were saying that it took the Russians months to capture Bakhmut, a town of 70,000 people. And by the way, the villages nearby, Solidar, my recollection was about 10,000 people. Places like Kurdyumovka, Klesheyevka, Opytnoye, Paraskovyevka, all of those places. Well, the Russians, however, did manage to take those places. I've given a whole list of important settlements that the Russians captured in the battle for Bakhmut, and the Russians, or to be more precise, the Wagner organization, have confirmed that the real offensive to capture Bakhmut began in November of 2022, following instructions from General Surovikin, who wanted to use Bakhmut as a place to attrition the Ukrainians down. And the fact is that once that offensive by the Russians began in earnest, they did capture all of those places, and of course by May they'd captured Bakhmut itself. By January, in other words, 2 months into the offensive, the Russians had captured a string of important villages in and around Bakhmut, and also, if recollection serves me rightly, the town of Soledar. Now, we are 2 months into the Ukrainian offensive, and all that they have to show for it up to now are a string of deserted villages. None of them with a pre-war population of more than 1,000 people. Now, I don't want to push this point too far. I accept that sometimes in war, a village of 500 people may be of greater strategical significance and therefore more difficult to capture and more pivotal to defense lines and therefore more important to be captured by an attacker than a town of 70,000. But the first thing to say is time is not the best measure of success, at least not in war, or at least not always in war. And secondly, by their own standards, the people who were making all those criticisms about how long it was taking for the Russians to take Bakhmut, well, perhaps they should now be making the same criticisms of Ukraine. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say about that. As I said, war is difficult, offensives are hard. I think people who make criticisms like the ones they did should be careful before they make them. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say about this. There have been also, and in addition to this, more Russian missile attacks. There was a Russian missile attack on Kryvyi Rog, by the way, Zelensky's hometown. It seems to have been carried out by an Iskander ballistic missile, surface-to-surface missile. And there's been attack, damage done to a civilian building and civilian casualties. And of course, there's again criticisms of the Russians over this. Let me repeat once more, I cannot myself provide a comprehensive or objective assessment of what happened. That would require an independent investigation of this incident, which of course is not going to take place. And in any event, and besides, I think that there is fairly strong evidence that again the damage was done not by this Iskander missile. Apparently those who understand these things and have looked at the footage think that the damage is not consistent with an Iskander missile strike, but more plausibly with a Ukrainian surface-to-air missile which sought to shoot down the incoming Russian missile and missed its target, falling down and hitting an apartment building, a civilian building instead. Well, that's all I'm going to say about that particular incident. Now, there are other things going on, and they're quite interesting. So, firstly, there was a scatter of reports yesterday that the Russians have found some means of jamming Ukraine's Starlink system. And this is, of course, the Starlink system that was created by Elon Musk, and which uses a very extensive satellite array to make it possible for people to obtain internet access in difficult places. It's said to be difficult to jam, and the Ukrainians, who right at the outset of the war were having problems with their communications because of Russian jamming, they converted entirely to the Starlink system, and this is the system that has basically enabled them to continue to communicate, to engage, to provide communication to their troops. But the Russians, by the way, can jam other Ukrainian communications, and do so is absolutely indisputable. I remember reading an article in a British newspaper, I forget which one, and I forget, but it was quite a recent article, in which a Ukrainian officer was complaining that his radios, his military radios, only work over distances of a few tens of meters because Russian jamming is now so severe. Now, this story about the Russians jamming the Starlink system is intriguing. I can't obviously verify it. Who can? But I do remember that some time ago, Elon Musk was becoming increasingly nervous about the future of Starlink. He was complaining about the way in which the Ukrainians were misusing Starlink. He said it was never intended to be used for a military purpose. By the way, that I take that with some, I notice what he says, but I wonder whether it is entirely the case. But anyway, let's put that aside. But anyway, that was what Elon Musk says. He wasn't happy about Ukraine using the Starlink system. There was talk that he had switched it off. There was criticism of this decision in Western media, Twitter, all over the place. People were complaining about Elon Musk, that he was depriving Ukraine of the essential communications that it needed in order to protect itself. He then agreed to switch it back on. I said at the time that I did wonder whether what was causing nervousness on the part of Elon Musk was evidence that the Russians were making progress in finding ways to jam Starlink, supposedly a system that is impervious to jamming, that the Russians, with their immense capabilities in electronic warfare, were beginning to get on top of this problem. Well, that was some months ago. We now have had more reports, including from Ukrainian sources, that the Russians have developed equipment that can jam Starlink in the field. I read another report on Slavyangrad, but it was Ukraine, which appeared to be Ukrainian sourced, that the Ukrainians are worried that this equipment is now being produced industrially in Russia, and it is going to be distributed presumably to the Russian troops. Well, if so, then Starlink might indeed be facing problems in Ukraine further down the line. And of course, if that causes a crisis for Ukraine's communication system, then that will be a disaster for Ukraine. Now, I would say this: the Russians may not yet have perfected devices, mechanisms to jam Starlink, but if we believe something that Sergei Shoigu said a few weeks ago, at the end of June, in a Security Council meeting with President Putin, the Russians are certainly able to listen in to Ukrainian communications, because Shoigu said that it was from intercepts of reports about casualties that the Russian Defense Ministry calculates Ukrainian losses. Now, I don't know for a fact that these are Starlink communications that the Russians are listening into. But of course, if they are, then I would have thought that that's only one step, the one big step towards jamming those communications. So anyway, we'll just have to see. This is a developing story, as they like to say. It may be that there's nothing to it. It may be that this is indeed about to happen. We don't know how long that will take, and we'll see how it works out. I would say that one should be careful assuming that systems that appear on the battlefield can be quite as decisive as some people suggest. A couple of months ago, I remember an awful lot of talk about a Russian system called penicillin, which used acoustic and optical sensors to assist Russians in counter-battery work. There was an awful lot of talk about how effective this was, and perhaps it was effective, perhaps it still is effective. But all I would say is, if so, I've heard less about it recently. So maybe it was not quite as decisive in the battlefields as some people think. But anyway, let's keep an open mind and see what happens. And the other thing that I've noticed, which is being commented upon with some annoyance from Russian commentators, there's a furious piece by the Russian commentator Yuri Podolyaka. I call him Russian, though I believe he was born in Sumy in Ukraine. But anyway, he is one of the most active commentators on the Russian side. Anyway, he is furious about this. The Russians have now been building decoys and sea barriers around the Kerch Bridge in order to prevent further attacks on the bridge by these Ukrainian seaborne drones. Podolyaka, in my opinion, absolutely rightly complains about why this wasn't done previously. So it seems like a basic precaution. I remember Putin saying that there would be cheap and simple technical means to protect the bridge from this kind of attack in the future. And, well, I suspect this is what Putin was referring to, and we see these sea defences being established, and it is indeed a puzzle, something of a mystery, that as to why this didn't happen before. Anyway, so things like that happening, of course, missile strikes, fighting going on all over the front lines. But overall, the story remains that Ukraine's offensive is stuck. And it continues to be stuck even as the Russians continue to push forward in Ukraine's on the northern part of this Ukrainian front line. They made more advances apparently yesterday in the Kupiansk, Svatovo, Kremenaya, Liman direction. The interesting thing about this Russian advance, which is being directed by General Medvedev, is that it is being conducted apparently over a fairly broad front. In other words, the Russians are not launching deep, narrow strikes, arrows if you like, towards Ukrainian defences. They've been very careful to make sure that their flanks are protected. So this is a broad-based advance rather than, as I said, a narrow, focused one. And that may suggest, there's maybe another reason to think that there aren't huge numbers of Russian troops involved, but whatever, the fact is that they are pressing forward. And today, shortly before I did this program, I got reports that another Ukrainian counterattack attempting to slow this advance had been defeated. and that on the back of the defeat of this counterattack, the Russians had occupied at least or at least a part of another important settlement on the way towards Kupiansk and the Oskol River. I'm not going to try and pretend that I know exactly where this place is or what its significance is, but the way it was reported, it did suggest that this was a big event, and there's even been some talk about some kind of a breakthrough being achieved. Well, again, I'm not sure about the full accuracy of this. We'll have to wait and see. So, that's the situation on the front lines. Russian advances in the north, static fighting everywhere else, conducted at very high levels of intensity. Ukraine failing to break through at any point, and 2 months into the offensive, it still hasn't reached the major Russian fortifications, the fortifications of the Surovikin line. A fact, by the way, which, as I said in my program yesterday, no Western media outlet that I have seen, certainly no British one, has to date actually admitted. So let's go back to those articles, and the point that those articles in the British and American media. And let's first of all pick off quickly the 3 British ones. I'm not going to go over Michael Clarke's article in the Sunday Times, the London Sunday Times yesterday, that appeared yesterday. I've already discussed that extensively in my program of yesterday, even if I misidentified it as being the article by Robert Clarke in the Daily Telegraph, for which, again, apologies. But the essential point, as I said, is that Michael Clarke, though determinedly putting an optimistic spin on Ukraine's offensive, essentially says that Ukraine only has limited time. Before long, events will start to close in, the weather will start to deteriorate, the Rasputitsa, the mud season, will start. Nobody talks about Ukrainian forces becoming exhausted, but of course we know that there's ammunition shortages. There was a very interesting piece recently in, I think it was a British newspaper, but I might be wrong, about the fact that Ukraine is now using North Korean manufactured rockets on its Grad multiple launch rocket systems. And obviously these were not rockets that were supplied by North Korea to Ukraine. North Korea backs Russia in this conflict. They were intercepted, they were seized on a ship that was traveling with these rockets. It was seized by an unnamed third country, almost certainly the United States, and it was this country that provided Ukraine with these North Korean rockets. At least that's the story that the article gave us, and it's plausible. The rockets are quite old. Most of them apparently date from the 1980s. There are some from the 1990s. We know that the United States has seized ships, freight ships, on the high seas. An act of piracy, in my opinion, most of the time. But anyway, I'm not going to go into the details of this at this point. Anyway, the United States has been seizing ships from the high seas. The ones we hear most about are Iranian ships. And in the Iran-Iraq war of the 1980s, Iran did indeed place significant orders for military equipment from North Korea, and it seems to me logical that North Korea would have supplied rockets to Grad rockets to Iran, and I suspect that the relationship continued and probably still continues still after the war ended. So it's entirely probable that this comes from a North Korean batch of rockets supplied by North Korea at the tail end of the Iran-Iraq war and in the years that followed. These are old rockets. They've deteriorated, as we'll see. They could have been disposed of by Iran, by perhaps Iran supplying them to some third party, or somebody in Iran seeking to supply them to some third party. The United States captured the ship in which they were being transported and sent them instead to Ukraine. And the Ukrainians are using them. And of course, these are old missiles. The Ukrainian soldiers complain that some of their behavior is very wild and that they do all sorts of wild and eccentric things. In other words, they blow up or go off course or do all sorts of things like that. But nonetheless, Ukraine is obliged to use them. And that, of course, is the key point. Because clearly, if Ukraine is using defective, old North Korean ammunition, some of it now 30 plus years old, long before its use by date, long after its use by date, then the situation with supplies must be very poor indeed. But anyway, Michael Clark, of course, doesn't tell us anything about that, nor, of course, does Robert Clark, nor does Richard Kemp, nor, as we shall see, does CNN. Anyway, they don't talk about that, but they do accept that conditions, the summer campaigning season is coming to an end, and things, therefore, have to speed up, otherwise the situation might not turn out well. And if you go to Robert Clark's article in the Daily Telegraph, you will see the same thing. He says that there's some evidence that Ukrainian troops appear to have been broken through the first line of Russia's heavily fortified defences in the south and east of the country. The possible road to Crimea has come into sight. And further down, he says that Ukrainian reports have confirmed the minefields and forward defences around the village of Rabotino, south of Orechov, in the Zaporozhye Oblast, have just been successfully navigated by Ukraine's 47th Mechanized Brigade. I am completely unaware of this advance. It's been referred to in several places. I suspect that this is still a misreporting of that incident with that Ukrainian infantry fighting vehicle trundling south of Rabotino and collapsing into a ditch, because I know of no Ukrainian advance in the Rabotino area. But anyway, coming back to what Robert Kemp is saying, Ukraine must now exploit this early breach if it is to sever the land bridge that connects the Russian mainland with Crimea. To do this will mean a hard fight to reach the sea, recapturing the key Russian-held towns of Tomak and Melitopol. Just to penetrate the initial Russian fortifications has been a painstaking progress. And then it talks at length about the minefields and all that. And then it goes on, Robert Clark goes on to say, if the defences around Rabotino are defeated, then the Russian garrison town of Tokmak lies within sight, less than 30 kilometres away. 30 kilometres? Such a short distance, given heavy Russian fortified lines. And then he goes on to say several more defensive lines lie between Rabotino and Tokmak, but these are likely far less heavily guarded than the initial ones the Ukrainians have pushed through. Well, as we know, that is not true. The major fortified lines lie to the south of Rabotino, and apart from that one solitary vehicle, the Ukrainians haven't reached it. And then he goes on to say, all of a sudden, Russia's prize land bridge is looking extremely vulnerable to a massed Ukrainian mechanized exploitation, made even more deadly with the arrival of the American-supplied Abrams tanks by September. So, all very confident, even if somewhat detached, or so it seems to me, from reality. But then we begin to see the doubts. This may all be promising, but time, that most unforgiving of battlefield considerations, is sadly not with the stoic Ukrainians. The next phase of the counteroffensive, the swift recapture of ground across Zaporozhye and Melitopol oblasts, will involve many weeks of hard fighting. How can something that's going to take many weeks of hard fighting be called swift? I will leave to Mr. Robert Clark to explain. And then he goes on to say the infamous Ukrainian Rasputitsa, or mud season, will soon be upon us as the torrential rains and flash floods of high summer turn the ground in eastern Ukraine into a marshy bog. Well, actually, it's in the autumn, but never mind. And then he goes on to say that if the Ukrainians have not managed to break through by the time the Rasputitsa starts, they'll be left with little choice but to double down. Notice that word, double down. We're going to come to it again. During the harsh winter months, and make swift armoured advances across the frozen ground as the Russian conscripts freeze in their static trenches. By spring, the Rasputitsa will be back. This will likely be the end of the counteroffensive phase. Or very fantastic, but anyway, that's what he says. So, if you can't succeed by the autumn, then try again in the winter. And if you don't succeed in the winter, then you haven't broken through by the spring, well, then you call it off, so that the offensive might have to last for a whole year, according to Robert Clark. I have to say, I find this all fantastical myself, but notice again the reference to doubling down, and the further reference to time. Time is running out. And he goes on to say that with forthcoming elections across the West likely to absorb political capital and war fatigue expected to kick in, Ukraine may only have a few short, precious months to recapture as much ground as swiftly as possible. Diplomatic pressure for Ukraine to accept some form of peace will amount next year, which will please a rearming Russia and its Chinese sponsors intent on a frozen conflict. Frozen conflict being, of course, what the Russians have already rejected, but never mind. So time, he accepts that time is running out on Ukraine, but what they must do is double down. They mustn't do what George Beebe and Mr. Webb said in that article in Time magazine. They mustn't go on the defensive. They mustn't themselves create fortifications. They certainly should not negotiate. No, that's absolutely not what Ukraine should do. They should continue launching more offensives over the winter, right up to the spring, and perhaps if they haven't achieved anything by then, well, that might be the moment to stop and pause and think what next to do. But it's those two words, double down and time, which are the key things to take away with. And now we go to CNN, article by CNN by far, I should say, the most intelligent of the articles up to now, up to this point. And we start. The Ukrainian military is doubling down on efforts to break through thick Russian defenses in its counteroffensive in the south, which has struggled to gain momentum since being launched at the beginning of June. And Ukrainian officials have said little about what fresh units have been committed to the offensive, but the military has clearly added recently minted units, in other words, their reserves, equipped with Western armour in at least one important sector of the southern front. And the article is much more pessimistic than the article by Robert Clark that I've just talked about. But again, we go on to lead that time really is not working to Ukraine's advantage. Time, in other words, is working against them. And they have an additional problem, according to this article, in that this article unusually admits that the Russians are making tactical advances of their own in the north and eastern fronts, so the Ukrainians have to retain substantial and capable forces along the straggling northern front. And there's a quote from an Australian general, General Mick Ryan. General Gerasimov, who we assume retains overall command of the Russian special military operation in Ukraine, is implementing a defensive strategy, but concurrently he is conducting offensive activities at the tactical and operational levels, especially along the front that leads north from Kreminna to Kupiansk. And the Kremlin has seized upon the slow progress of the Ukrainian counteroffensive, a rare opportunity to go beyond damage limitation. And then we do read further in the article about the fact that there may be problems, but we hear that this is absent an unexpected collapse of Russian lines. Ukrainian line gains are likely to occur over a long period and interspersed with lulls and periods of slower and more grinding efforts as the Ukrainians come to successive Russian defensive lines and themselves require relief and rotation. And I suspect this will remain these are quotes from officials at the Institute of the Study of War. I suspect this will remain a bloody attritional fight with reserve units being fed incrementally in the coming weeks and months. This is from a tweet by somebody called Gaddy, who is at the Institute of the Study of War, and he gives a warning that if that is the case and this conflict begins to resemble the static front lines that began to solidify in Donbass in 2015-2016, other questions will arise. So bleak outcomes for Ukraine, time again, not on their side, and once again we're told they must double down. We come to Richard Kemp, our old friend at the Daily Telegraph, and as we will see, he says essentially the same thing. He says that if Ukraine must be prepared to lose the White House, and this is all connected to the politics of this conflict, which we will come to briefly, but he says things like this: despite frustration at the slow pace of Ukraine's advance, no one can question the need for extensive battlefield shaping in military language. And then there is, in my opinion, an entirely irrelevant comparison between the current Ukrainian offensive, the progress of the current Ukrainian offensive, and the bombing war that the United States and its allies conducted against Iraq during the first Iraq War of 1991. I think any comparison between what Ukraine is trying to do on the existing battlefields with what the United States, with 1 million men and the most powerful air force in the world, achieved against Saddam Hussein's forces is, to put it mildly, misplaced. But then after giving us a completely, in my opinion, false picture of Ukrainians trying to shape the battlefield in the way that the Americans did in that war, Mr. Kemp, Colonel Kemp I should call him, comes to the gist of it. If and when Ukrainian troops succeed in smashing through the first line of Russian defences, which they have not yet achieved, that is an admission from someone from in the media, the Western media, that Ukraine has not so far, despite the claims by CNN, by Michael Clark and Robert Clark, that Ukraine has managed to achieve some kind of breakthrough. Richard Kemp takes a different view. They have not yet achieved a breakthrough. If and when Ukrainian troops succeed in smashing through the first line of defences, which they have not yet achieved, the road ahead will be very long and very bloody. They face mile after mile of obstacles, including tank traps, barbed wire and minefields, plus dug-in infantry, pillboxes, machine guns, tanks, artillery fire, combat planes, attack helicopters, drones and missiles. And that he says that war is more unpredictable than any other human activity, which is absolutely true. But he goes on to say, but after spending 2 precious months trying to shape the battlefield, as the autumn mud approaches, there remains only a matter of weeks before any armoured advance will become bogged down. This means offensive operations will have to pause at least until the onset of the winter freeze in November, and possibly until next spring. Again, the assumption that, you've only got a couple of weeks till you become bogged down, and Ukraine has run through 2 months of that already, and there's not much time left. But then the fantasy that if the offensive has bogged down by the autumn, it can be resumed in some way in the winter or the spring. But then, of course, Richard Kemp comes on and discusses the politics of this. He says that the longer the war takes, the more difficult it will become to maintain Western support for Ukraine. He makes some absolutely fantastical claims, again, about how the United States doesn't really want Ukraine to win too decisively because supposedly it's afraid of a Russian collapse. We can completely ignore all of that. But he does raise, again, the concern that the more the conflict continues, the more difficult it will become to sell this war in Washington. And with the election looming in the United States next year, the more challenging for Ukraine the political situation will eventually become. And then yet again we see repetitions about how the Russians occupied substantial areas of Georgian territory in 2008 and of Ukraine in 2014. Of course, Georgia and Ukraine were not actors, according to Richard Kemp, either in 2008 or in 2014. It's entirely the Russians' fault that there was conflicts in those 2 years, in those 2 places. And the Russians, however, will then be able to absorb the territory that they have captured. And then, according to Richard Kemp, it will only be a matter of time before Russia resumes its aggression. So, 4 articles, one in the American media by CNN, 3 in the British media, all of which are telling us the same thing. Ukraine is running out of time. Its offensive has failed to make the anticipated progress. It's got enormous obstacles lying in its path. Unless there's a breakthrough quickly, unless Ukraine is able to wrap things up by the end of the summer, eventually the season of the autumn rains and the mud will come in and the offensive will be stuck. Now, the British cling on to this fantasy that when the mud season is over, Ukraine can somehow resume its offensive in the winter or the spring. But I don't think anybody who is familiar with the battlefield realities, with the Ukraine, as I said, now having to rely on plundered North Korean ammunition to keep its Grad launchers going, with a Ukraine that has run out of 155mm shells, and with its prime backer, the United States, having run out of those shells also, and having to make do in both cases with cluster munitions, which are increasingly less effective in this kind of war, with a Ukraine without an air force to speak of, with a Ukraine with a manpower pool that is continuously shrinking, and with an economy that is surviving on life support. The idea that if this offensive can succeed, Ukraine can come again against Russia, come back again and launch this offensive all over again in the winter and the spring against a Russian colossus, which is rearming and becoming economically stronger. Siluanov, the Russian finance minister, has again come out and said that Russia now confidently expects growth of in excess of 2% this year. Well, the idea that Ukraine has any prospect of victory if this offensive fails to deliver it is a fantasy. And I strongly suspect that people like Robert Clark and Richard Kemp deep down understand that. In fact, looking at what Richard Kemp is saying when he talks about the enormous obstacles that Ukraine will face, that it's not even after 2 months of intense fighting managed to penetrate the first Russian line of defense. Actually, as I repeat again, properly speaking, if you take the first line of defense to be the first elements of the Surovikin line, Ukraine hasn't even reached it yet. But if you go on to read what he says about the road ahead being very long and very bloody, mile after mile of obstacles, including tank traps, barbed wire and minefields, plus dug-in infantry, pillboxes, machine guns, tanks, artillery fire, combat planes, attack helicopters, drones and missiles, all of which Russia has increasing quantities of, putting aside the military equipment. I've been talking already about the fact that, according to Shoigu, 1,400 men in Russia are enlisting into the military every day, volunteering into the military every day. Well, if you think of it in that way, you begin to understand how ludicrous and fantastical the idea of Ukraine renewing its offensive in some form after the autumn muds becomes. Now, I'm going to say straight away, I think that Michael Clark and Robert Clark and Richard Kemp are actually intelligent men, and despite some of the extraordinary things that they say, I have to say that in Richard Kemp's case, some of his opinions, I find frankly concerning, but I've no doubt that they have a much clearer understanding of the conflict than they are letting on to. I think that the realities of the conflict than they're letting on to. And I think Richard Kemp's article in particular makes that fairly clear. I think the reason that they're holding out for the idea of a renewed offensive by Ukraine in the winter or the spring is because they're terrified that if they acknowledge that the failure of this summer offensive by Ukraine is established and becomes conclusive, then the pressure that they're so worried about pressure from the West, from the United States, from people in the United States, pressure increasingly within Germany as well, where the AfD is now surging in the opinion polls, pressure for a negotiated outcome, which is the last thing they want to see, a negotiated outcome which concedes Ukrainian defeat, will grow. So rather than face up to that reality, they pretend, face up to the reality of a failing war. They cling instead to the fantasy of a renewed Ukrainian offensive in the winter and the spring. Overall, if you strip out those fantasies, if you look at what all of these articles are saying, they're all saying the same thing. The Ukrainian offensive is bogged down, it's stuck, Ukraine is running out of time, it has to achieve a breakthrough fast. If it doesn't, then the offensive has failed, and that the prospects for Ukraine moving beyond the offensive, beyond the autumn, are going to darken significantly. So that's what all of these articles are saying. Before I conclude, I should quickly say that I find that the fantasy of a renewed Ukrainian offensive beyond the autumn, not just unreal, but also disturbing. And to my mind, it confirms a point that Putin himself is increasingly making, and which is being made increasingly by other Russian officials and commentators, that there do seem to be some people in the West who want to see this war go on until the last Ukrainian. Peace negotiations are obviously a far better way than that, and it is astonishing to me that people like the two Clarks and Kemp and the authors of that CNN piece don't seem to grasp that. So there we are, a offensive that is stuck in the zone of control that the Russians established in front of their fortified lines, growing panic in the West that before long it will be stuck in the autumn muds as well, but it is therefore visibly starting to fail. Growing alarm that if it fails, pressure for negotiations will start, and a determination on the part of some people, on the neocons, of which to some extent all of these people whose articles I have just cited from are, a determination that the war go on regardless of the failure of this offensive, and in my opinion, as I said, in a way that gives traction to Russian criticism that the demand is that the war continue until the last Ukrainian. Well, there we go. Now, Vladimir Putin has continued to be busy. He's still, I believe, in St. Petersburg. He's wrapped up his meeting with the African leaders. As he said, he's met with all of those that attended, all 17 of them, one-on-one. He's apparently going to produce a statement responding to the various points that the African leaders made over the course of their meeting with him, in which they discussed peace negotiations in Ukraine. And of course, predictably, he's going to reiterate again that the Russians are willing to engage in Ukrainians in negotiation, but that the Ukrainian stance makes that impossible. And incidentally, and for the record, I think this meeting in Jeddah, which the Saudis are preparing to assemble, is intended to get the Ukrainians to understand that the stance that they're taking at the present time against negotiations is unsustainable and must be changed, and must be changed now. I think that is what the Saudis are aiming to do. That is what they're getting all those other countries together to say to the Ukrainians and to Ukraine's Western sponsors at this meeting in Jeddah. And I wanted to say that apparently Ukrainian representatives have been told to come to this meeting, but the Russians will not be there. The reason I think that this happened, and I think this is now clear, is because the Saudis are concerned that if the Russians aren't there, the Ukrainians won't come. And I think that the Saudis feel that it's time the Ukrainians were given a strong talking to. And I suspect that that is what we're going to see at this meeting in Jeddah in a few days. And I would also add, by the way, that like that, the previous meeting in Copenhagen that preceded it, the previous meeting in this series, I suspect that very little information will come out of this meeting when it takes place. I want to finish with one last topic, which is the coup in Niger. Now, I should say straight away that when I learnt about the coup in Niger, I had not realized two things. One, I should have remembered from before, which is that Niger is Europe's principal, well, I suspect today it is its principal supplier of uranium. Previously, before the crisis with Russia, the Europeans imported uranium and nuclear material from Russia, and I suspect also to some extent from Kazakhstan. Maybe they can still import it from Kazakhstan to some extent, but I think that despite rumors and concerns that expressed sometimes amongst Russian commentators that Kazakhstan might go over to the other side, I suspect that overall that's not going to happen, and the Europeans recognize that fact, and they probably don't regard Kazakhstan as a fully reliable partner. Niger is, I suspect, where they get most of their uranium today. And I suspect it is the country from which France gets most of its uranium. And it's important to remember that France is not only the former colonial power in Niger and the country that essentially has dominated internal politics in Niger for a very long time, but France is also a country with a major civil nuclear program. Unlike other European countries, it relies very heavily on nuclear energy to supply the bulk of its electric power. So an interruption of supplies from Niger, not though I think that is actually threatened by this coup. Why would Niger stop supplying uranium to France? I mean, presumably it's in the interests of the coup leaders that trade continue. But anyway, I suspect that even the mere possibility that there might be potential interruptions in the supply of uranium from Niger, I would have thought that would cause extreme alarm in France. And the other thing, which I absolutely did not know, that the first part about Niger's importance as a supplier of uranium, I did know, but I sort of forgot about it. But the second thing I did not know, and that is that there is already a significant US military presence in Niger, almost certainly, I suspect, linked to its critical importance as a uranium supplier, and the fact that the United States wants to safeguard that control of that uranium, even though, of course, those US troops, apparently they number around 1,000, are supposed to be helping Niger combat jihadi terrorist movements, which are indeed active in this part of the world. So, unsurprisingly, given the very high stakes, and especially given the film that's coming out of Niger, of large crowds in the capital supporting the coup against the ousted president, and flying, amongst others, Russian flags, unsurprisingly, in light of all of this, there is now growing indications that other African states, Nigeria, I am sure, encouraged by the United States and by France, and Britain as well, by the way, are thinking about intervening militarily in Niger in order to restore the previous president. And there is now, I think, a strong possibility, ECOWAS, one of the local organizations that are bringing together the various African states, have condemned the coup in strongest terms. I think there's a very real possibility that we will see Nigerian intervention, military intervention, very soon. Now, I should say Nigeria and the ECOWAS states probably have their own reasons for wanting to intervene in Niger. These will almost certainly be separate from those of the West. But it's becoming increasingly clear to me that too many countries, France, the United States, the European Union, the ECOWAS states, Nigeria itself, have a stake in the maintenance of the previous government in Niger for this coup to be allowed to consolidate itself. And as I said, there's a high probability that, given the fact that there are so many interests pointing in the different direction, there is a real probability of some kind of military intervention coming. It will be very interesting to see, if this intervention does happen, whether the Nigerians, who I presume will be the key party involved, and the Americans and the French cooperate with each other. Anyway, that's what I would say about what is happening in Niger. Whether it is wise for Nigeria to intervene in Niger, whether they might find that they're taking on more than they bargained for, whether, given the protests in the capital, which seem to suggest that there is genuine support for the military and opposition to the previous government, whether, as I said, it's wise for anyone at all to intervene in this situation, is a completely different matter. We will just have to wait and see. But, as I said, an intervention in Niger seems to me to be on the cards, and it probably explains also, by the way, why the Russians have been extremely careful to say almost nothing about this coup and certainly to give away no suggestion that they support it. Anyway, we'll see what happens in Niger. We'll see whether there is an intervention by Nigeria or by the Western powers or both. And one way or another, this is where I end my program today. So we will see what Ukraine does. We'll see what happens in places like the Vremevka ledge, Staromayorsk, the Orekhov area. But I'm going to make a further observation. If by the middle of August we're still fighting over the same villages, then the pressure on Ukraine is going to be on. We're going to start to see increasing concern in Western capitals about the direction of the conflict. We'll probably start to see criticism of Ukraine and its tactics starting to go beyond what we have seen in the media up to now, and perhaps statements from Western officials telling Ukraine that they have to up their game in some way. And there is also a possibility that the focus will anyway begin to shift from the battlefronts in the south and in the east, where Ukraine at the moment is attacking, towards the situation in the north, where the offensive is being conducted by Russia. So we'll see what happens. I think we are in that kind of situation at the moment where the West just about has its panic under control. But as I said, if in 2 weeks' time there hasn't been a breakthrough, then I suspect visible signs of panic in the West will start to emerge. And of course, when people are panicking, when they become frightened, that is when they become most dangerous. So still a long way to go, but we will see what happens. So that's me for today. More from me soon. To remind you again, we have you can find all our videos on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. And last but not least, if you should check out our shop. And if you've liked what we do, like this video, remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon, and have a very good day.